Coming on to the end of the session, this is the last session that I am going to call for. The session is titled Disasters and Opportunity for the Opportunist. This is to be presented by Ms. Ipshita Shee. She is the registered nurse at Stoke Mandeville Hospitals, which treats generally the spinal cord injured patients, maybe war victim, maybe some sports victim, or maybe disaster victims. Stoke Mandeville Hospital, United Kingdom, is the best rehabilitation hospital dedicated for the management of spinal cord injuries, especially high tetras. High tetra injuries are to be treated best at Stoke Mandeville Hospital. She is a registered nurse there.
Topic. When the natural disasters strike, they often cause the personal and the financial difficulty for both individuals and communities and can result in loss of life, as we all know. But that is not only the effect which the disaster can occur, but the immediate effect on that of a natural disaster materialize through other three channels, like disruptions of physical capital, such as the housing, commercial building, vehicles, infrastructure such as roads, and population displacement and disruptions of economic activities. So in emergencies and humanitarian crises, some unnoticed and unavoidable issues are potential to rise up, such as human trafficking, gender-based violence, abuse including children and women, and so on and so forth. The lists are very long. So these are some of the long-term effects on population in post-disaster phase, where the opportunists utilize scope to target the vulnerable group of population. So in the next slides we will see why. So why in the post-disaster phase these are rising up? Disaster actually act as a catalyst for the opportunist. Natural disasters are unique and will affect region or the countries differently according to the infrastructure and the capabilities. A disaster may necessitate displacement, and any subsequent destabilization can increase in the individual's risk, obviously. If a natural disaster does not necessitate displacement, damages to the region can increase in the likelihood. For example, in 2007 and 2009, cyclones in Bangladesh damaged millions of homes, acres of croplands, and thousands of kilometers of roads and embankments. People may be more vulnerable because they are displaced from their home and temporarily staying in a shelter. Then they are separated from their families and friends, disconnected from supportive services, unable to safely arm. They are economically unstable at that moment. So these are very important issues. Other than that, we can also identify some other issues like people won't speak the local languages, and that is make them more vulnerable because they can't communicate with the local authorities. They are afraid of physical harm and stigma and have no access to assistance, services or protection provided by the local laws. So we start with human trafficking. Why? What is human trafficking? Let's discuss that one and how this is increased during the post-disaster phase. Human trafficking is a very, very serious public health concern both domestically and worldwide. Perpetrators of human trafficking manipulate and exploit others' vulnerabilities for profit. Human trafficking is a crime that occurs when the trafficker compels a victim by force, fraud, or coercion to perform labor, services, or commercial sex. And it is the world's second largest criminal industry, generating an estimated $150 billion annually. So during environmental or public health disaster, traffickers can control victims through their need for basic resources such as food, water, shelter, and other control methods can be physically assaulting or threatening serious harm, psychologically manipulating or shaming, providing false promises about work or living conditions, pretending to have an intimate relationship, pretending to provide protection, withholding wages or debt bondage, isolating the victims. So these are various ways how the traffickers catch up the vulnerable group from the population in post-disaster phase and put them down and make them channelized towards the human trafficking. If we are talking about human trafficking, the most vulnerable groups are the two. One are children, is a woman. So if we talk about child trafficking, children orphaned or separated from their parents, women who have lost their homes and livelihoods, and migrants flooding into the disaster-stricken area to work are particularly at risk for trafficking post-disaster. Illegal adoption can also occur post-disaster as traffickers take advantage of displaced children, selling them to remote families who believe they are helping a child in need. It was prevalent after the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, when an unknown number of children were taken illegally from the country for international adoption. So this is really very bad. And women trafficking, that is another weaker part of the society. Women also face an elevated trafficking risk post-disaster, especially for sex trafficking. Post-disaster, women may lose their jobs and homes, leading to poverty and financial debt that also channelize them towards the trafficking. For example, after Hurricane Harvey, the prevalence of adult advertisement online doubled, with many offering rent-free accommodations to any pretty girls wanting to make some quick money and recover losses happened from Harvey. That is happening in US. So you can just identify how the people are channelized towards the trafficking during disaster phase. In August 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall in Louisiana, impacting the Pelican State with winds up to 174 miles per hour. Many individuals displaced from the storm become victims of human trafficking. In the 5 years following Katrina, over 3,750 survivors of human trafficking were identified in the Gulf Coast region alone. These are only identified people. There may be a lots of can be there in the country. Next, we can talk about gender-based violence. So, gender-based violence is actually an umbrella term for any harmful act that is perpetrated against a person's will and that is based on socially ascribed or gender differences between male and female. And gender-based violence increases in disaster across the world. Suggested risk factors includes increased life ratios, failure of law enforcement, exposure to high-risk environment, exacerbations of existing gender inequalities, and unequal social norms. So, 2 points are very important. One is exposure to high-risk environment. During disaster, this happened. Another one is already or pre-existing gender inequalities that is made more vulnerable of happening gender-based violence afterwards. And these are causing different kinds of gender-based violence. So gender-based violence can be rape, physical assault, sexual assault, psychological or emotional abuse, forced marriage, denial of resources, services or opportunities, sexual exploitations and abuse called as SIA as a short form. So these are all different kinds of gender-based violence happen anytime with anyone. So if we talk about gender-based violence in Latin America, data reveals that on the southern frontiers of Mexico, 70% of migrant women are victims of violence and 60% suffer from some kind of sexual abuse during their journey. Brazil and Colombia are the main transit points for trafficking in Latin America, and the Dominican Republic is listed among the 4 countries of the world with the highest proportions of women trafficked for sexual exploitations. In the aftermath of the Haiti earthquake in 2010, unsafe living conditions, lack of private bathing facilities, lack of lighting, and lack of police presence have been indicated among the contributing factors of sexual violence against women and girls in the camp, including sexual exploitation and abuse by humanitarian workers. So you can just identify humanitarian workers, they are not even safe, so we have to be more cautious when we are talking about them. And what can be the consequences of gender-based violence? So reporting and law enforcement mechanism as well as services for survivors of gender-based violence are often disrupted by disaster. Actually, the law enforcement, every services to safeguard the population are already weakened. So it is very difficult to raise the incident and work upon it. This also hamper the collections of data. So prevalence of the gender-based violence, how it is, what is the actual data or the number of cases that cannot be identified. Several of the country studies noted that police records are missing or maybe very poor. Most of the country's disaster plans do not include the arrangements and preventing or addressing the GBV. This reflects and may contribute to low awareness of gender-based violence in disaster. People are not aware about it, so they are not involved this part in the policies or planning phase of disaster management. With respect to the health emergencies, academic research indicates that GBV increases the incidence of HIV/AIDS. Afterwards, anecdotal reports from practitioners and government indicate that gender-based violence increased during the Ebola crisis even. So these are the general consequences of gender-based violence. Another point is very important, and that is for the most vulnerable group of the society, that is the children. Children are the most vulnerable in disaster. Typically, in developing countries, children hold a high percentage of the population. Because of the consequences of climate change, number of natural disasters is rising, and every year around 400 disasters occurs globally, affecting the most vulnerable groups. Among them are the children. For example, in Haiti, around 40% of the total populations are under 18 years of age. Physiologically and psychologically, children have less chance to cope and survive in acute and chronic traumatic incidents. Children are actually dependent on their parents or carer to get access for their food, shelter, clothing, medical care, security, and so on. So they are very vulnerable group of the society. In addition, they suffer more from physical injuries too. So disaster lead to the disruptions of social structures, and the social structures normally used to protect the children, and during disaster these are disrupted, so that increase the exposure and likelihood of the violence, particularly against the children. So that is causing them abuse. If we talk about different scenarios of child abuse, we can see significant increase in violence were observed before and after Katrina's storm. The result shows that as compared to before the storm, more absence from schools were reported. That is quite obvious. And research shows in 2007 in Bangladesh, after flood, the most families affected by the flood of 90% find it difficult to find food and shelter, and thus become more violent for their children at home. As they cannot fulfill their own need, they cannot give feed to the children, so they are making them more abusive. They are become more abusive towards their children, maybe physically or sometimes emotionally. A large population of the children were subject to violence of their parents during the floods. 70% by mother, 40% by the father. The research says that. The level of violence was related to the socio-economic level, and the lower the status of the family, the more violence was applied. And it is also seen that mothers are more emotionally abusing the children, whereas the fathers are doing more the physical abuse. So these are the different aspects of children abuse has been seen because of the disruptions of the normal social norms. That is the reason it happened. And some of the sexual abuse are also related as a part of the child abuse. These are all comes under gender-based violence. So these are different issues that are rising up post-disaster phase. But now the thing is, what action can be taken to face the gender-based violence or the trafficking or abuse in emergency context? Due to the complex environment that accompanies emergency situations, the issues of human trafficking, gender-based violence or abuse are not often incorporated as a variable of immediate or necessary attention by government or non-governmental organizations. So it's very important that we give more attention towards that factors. And however, it is essential to protect the rights and dignity of all persons affected by the disaster, including migrants, before, during, and after an emergency. Some fight against trafficking in person in emergency situation must be understood as a measure of immediate assistance to save lives. Trafficking must be considered as much of a priority as any other response to an emergency situation aimed at guaranteeing to comprehensive protection of vulnerable people, whether national or migrant. That is why anti-trafficking activities deserve a place in the comprehensive protection approach that is applied in emergency situation. So these are very big terms we are discussing about. Let's see some key points or actions which could be taken for making more awareness of these issues post-disaster phase, like education and awareness campaign, disseminate tools to detect possible human trafficking cases and know to whom to refer. This is very important that people should be aware about where to report, what to do if these things are happen. Then execute preventive and non-reactive actions. Then good coordination among governmental, non-governmental organization, the camps, the shelter. So these people must provide a good support services to the vulnerable group, and their immediate basic needs must be fulfilled, like getting access of the food, water, proper lighting, sanitary services for the women and the girls. So these all basic needs, if these are fulfilled, obviously the rate or the chances of but the focus needed in certain aspects like sexual and gender-based violence is a topic for further studies. When I got this topic to discuss about, I didn't find so many different research studies on these topics, because these are all very different kinds of topics where the incidents are not reported at all. The data these which we are getting that are also misleading us because the numbers are not actual, and the research studies which already has been done, these are also very few to make some generalized conclusion or help in developing some planning or policies in preparedness of disaster. So despite the importance of the recent humanitarian crisis in Syria, Iraq and Yemen, this disaster have not been adequately studied by researchers. With regard to the violence against children, we can see that these are the common example we can find, like these are very recent issues already happened. There also the research has not been done for the violence against children. Similarly, the earthquake in Pakistan, the Iran with substantial damages have not been studied in reviewed articles. So the research articles are mostly for the physical damage, the loss of life, the immediate effect on the population. These all issues has been discussed, but not the issues like human trafficking or all, where the opportunities or the people who are making this kind of crime is not been identified or enlightened, so that we will get the exact data and make some preparedness, the planning about the same. Basically, gender-based violence, human trafficking, child abuse in emergencies caused by natural disaster is largely neglected area of concern both globally and regionally, lacking attention by both disaster management and international gender-based violence players. Not only do few studies exist on the possible linkage between these issues and disaster situations, but also very few programs have been implemented to address these issues in disaster response and recovery. The main gaps are in the area of disaster preparedness, with essentially no mention of GBV related issues in either contingency planning or in early warning. On the other side, disaster recovery appears more mindful of the need to address and mitigate gender-based violence trafficking among the affected population. So actually the need is to implement the policies and procedures in the preparedness planning of the disaster and identifying these issues, and then we can aware the people more about the same, so that the vulnerability of the population would be reduced afterwards and this kind of issues cannot be risen up too much. That way maybe these issues can be going down a little bit. For all these things we need more research, more data, so that we can get the actual number how these are affected. We can get actual scenario, maybe domestically or the globally. That way we can be more enlightened with some of the studies and which help us for some future planning and preparing for the disaster management. So that is my topic as the disaster opportunity for the opportunists. I hope you get little idea about all these things which we have discussed today. These are few sites where from I got some idea and some relevant data to discuss all these things in my presentation. As today I am not present, so if anyone have any queries or any, please you can contact me in that mail ID, that is ipshita.shee@yahoo.com. I hope you got some idea about the topic. Thank you very much.